Thank you for joining us for this event. My name is Nick, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon. Before we begin, I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events and live events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't already do so, please follow us on our social media channels via Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. Tonight, though, we are thrilled to welcome Daniel Mendelsohn in conversation with Ayad Akhtar, talking about Daniel's new book, Three Rings, A Tale of Exile, Narrative, and Fate. Daniel Mendelsohn's essays and translations have appeared frequently in the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, the New York Times Book Review, and many other publications. And his books include An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, and The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, which won the National Jewish Book Award and the Prix Medicis. In this genre-defying book, best-selling memoirist and critic Daniel Mendelsohn explores the mysterious links between the randomness of the lives we lead and the artfulness of the stories we tell. Combining memoir, biography, history, and literary criticism, Three Rings weaves together the stories of three exiled writers who turn to the classics of the past to create masterpieces of their own, works that pondered the nature of narrative itself. The lives of these three writers are linked across borders, languages, and centuries, allowing the reader to reconsider the relationship between narrative and history, art, and life. Mendelsohn will be joined in conversation by Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright and novelist Ayad Akhtar, whose work has been published and performed in over 24 languages. He is the author of the novel Homeland Elegies, the plays Junk, Disgrace, The Who and the What, and The Invisible Hand, and he is currently serving as the president of PEN America. This evening's event will include an audience Q&A, so please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question you'd also like to know the answer to, please upvote that particular question by clicking the thumbs up button. Lastly, support Daniel and Powell's by purchasing a copy of his book from us tonight. A link to buy Three Rings will be shared in the chat a couple times tonight, as well as books by Ayad too. All right, Daniel and Ayad, thank you so much for joining us, and we're thrilled to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
You're
Hi,
welcome.
Daniel.
Hey, Ayad, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. I'm terrifically honored and very, very delighted to speak about this book, which I love a lot. I noticed in the chat that David Nyman is here. Do you know who David Nyman is, Daniel?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. If some of my questions are a little developed, you have David to blame, because I was thinking of an interview that I did with David, which went deep, and I permitted myself, because of the fact that I knew I was going to have you for an hour, that I'd be able to sort of dig in a little bit. So let's begin, unless you would like to say something to our fine guests here.
No, let's jump in, and then our guests will be able to jump in with us in a little bit.
Yes, and please, by all means, all of you, put your questions as they occur to you into the chat, and we'll get to them toward the end.
Definitely.
So you start this exquisite book with an image of a stranger arriving in an unknown city after a long voyage, separated from his family, tired, his shoulders hunched by the weight of the bags he's carrying. He stands before a building that is to be his home, and then disappears into the darkness of the arch that is the entryway, as if into the jaws of a mythic monster, or as if into the barren sea. It's a dramatic and poetic circumstance standing at the center of a series of concentric circles of reflection, recollection, commentary, digression, and return to that central image of a vacant wanderer arriving with his bags, literal and metaphorical, at a blank new place. That wanderer is variously Odysseus, Erich Auerbach, W.G. Sebald, any number of historical refugees from the various historic conflicts you invoke: a Syrian, a Bosnian, a Kurd, an Angolan, a Ugandan, a Jew, or a Huguenot. Today could be a Ukrainian. That wanderer is also you. You return to this image time and again to elaborate and expand, to journey off again through language and incident, back again to the arrival of the stranger on the doorstep. How did the image occur to you? Which I suppose is another way of asking, how did this book start? How did it take shape, and what was its genesis?
So it's a great way to start. Thank you, Ayad. So the genesis of this book was rather interesting. While I was writing my previous big book, An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic, which was about how the last year of my late father's life was sort of refracted. It came to be refracted through the Odyssey in various ways, among others, by taking a seminar that I was conducting on the Odyssey. And as I was writing that book, which was about this experience I had having my father as a student in my Odyssey class, and several other things, it sort of grew and to include a series of ruminations on the kind of afterlife of the Odyssey of Homer, how it had affected other writers through the millennia, including me. And then, and I'm sure you know what this is like, at a certain point I realized that my book had grown two heads, and that all this material about the afterlife of the Odyssey belonged somewhere else. So I cut big chunks of it out and I sort of stuck it in a file, and I thought, I'll come back to this later at some point. But I wasn't exactly sure what the vehicle was. And then I was invited to do a series of lectures at my alma mater, University of Virginia, in early 2019, or maybe it was 2018. And I had to give them as, it was a great honor. It was my alma mater. It's a series of 3 lectures over 3 afternoons. And so I just said, oh, this will be a great way to use this stuff. But it hadn't really crystallized in my mind. And for whatever reasons, I was also interested in sort of weaving in the kind of meta story about how hard it had been for me to write the Odyssey book. Because I've been thinking a lot about just storytelling, narrative, the narrative of the subtitle of 3 Rings. And I thought, well, maybe somehow all this stuff is connected. The afterlife of the Odyssey, the struggles I had writing an Odyssey, blah, blah, blah. And I have to say, it's the only time, we always talk about the light bulb moment, and it never happens to me, It's not how I work, but for once in my life, I had a light bulb moment. And I remember I was on a, what do you call it? An elliptical machine at the gym. Maybe it was the wheels turning, I don't know. And I suddenly just had this image. I needed a kind of symbolic figure whose outlines could sort of encompass these various kinds of distressed people that I was interested in. Myself, because this book is about this sort of writer's crisis that I had writing a book. Odysseus, famously a wanderer, and a couple of the people whose life stories I had encountered while working up this material about the afterlife of the Odyssey. Erich Auerbach, the great German scholar whose study of Western literature begins with a famous chapter on the Odyssey, and who was himself a refugee from Hitler. And as Nick just mentioned, one of my books is about the Holocaust, so it's a subject I feel very connected to. And W.G. Sebald, the German writer, who was sort of self-exiled from Germany because of the unbearable weight of historic guilt. And some other people. And I just literally just sort of saw this figure, a kind of a wanderer who's washed up someplace. He doesn't know where it is. He has no support. He has no bearings, I think is the right way to put it. And so, as you know, that paragraph, in very slightly varied, which you paraphrased so eloquently just before, is the way that the major sections of my little book, 3 Rings, begins. And I just felt like I wanted to keep putting this figure before the eyes of the reader, this refugee, from literal or figurative, who has to start over again. It was an image that just presented itself to me.
It's a beautiful one, and there's a way in which I found the book enchanting is not even really the right word. I will get to a little bit later what I found so remarkable about it. I mean, it gave me the chills of the miraculous at moments where there were these convergences, and that technique of that recursive technique of coming back to that image is accrues power over the course of what is ultimately quite a short book, and yet you cover so much ground. So early on, you allude to some of the, you just alluded in your answer to some of the difficulties you were having with the Odyssey book. And so early on in this book, you share that dilemma that you've been writing about. You're writing a book that would become an Odyssey, the book about your father, your passion for the Greeks, and the seminar on Homer's epic that your father was a part of. And you write that this book you'd been struggling with was in manuscript form by August 2016. You had about 600 pages or something like that. And yet you recognize that it still somehow wasn't working. And a mentor of yours who is unnamed, and I'm curious who that is, but I'm not going to ask you, with whom you shared the manuscript, suggests after reading it that all the pieces are there. You just haven't found the story with which to make those pieces cohere.
Right.
And later, you take us on a digression, a sublime digression into Aristotle's how-to manual for the ages. It's a book that I read endlessly, the Poetics, where he describes a flaw of certain epic poems, which will present events as incidents following one another in a kind of historic or a time mode, as opposed to epics that are shaped by plot, that is arranged by a unifying action. So this is just a little taste of the kind of vivid excursions you take us on as you weave us, not only on your tale, but introduce us into the very pleasurable atmosphere of association, which I think is one of the great pleasures of this book. But I wonder if you wouldn't mind talking a little bit about this distinction between history versus plot, or accumulation of incident versus story, and how and where you landed on this in Three Rings.
So yeah, so the problem I had with An Odyssey, the manuscript that became An Odyssey, is I wanted to tell this story, and I was making the terrible mistake of telling it in the order it happened, which is, of course, one obvious way to tell a story. So as I mentioned, in the spring of 2011, my father announced that he wanted to be a student in my freshman Odyssey seminar. Then in the summer of 2011, we heard about a cruise that recreated the voyages of Odysseus, and he said, let's go on. So we went on. In the autumn of 2011, he had an accident in a parking lot and died a few months later of a stroke that resulted from a blood clot caused by that accident. So there were sort of three acts: the classroom, the cruise, and the hospital, basically. And I had the manuscript. I'm a critic. I know when something isn't working. It's what I do for a living. But so I know as a writer myself when my own stuff isn't working. But the reason writers have editors is because you often can't solve your own problems. And I had these 600 pages, and I just knew it was sort of dead in the water. It just wasn't happening. So I showed it to my great friend Bob Gottlieb, who was this sort of legendary editor, had run several publishing companies and was the editor of the New Yorker. And I said, Bob, what is wrong with this? It's all there. And he called me the next day. He's very famous for reading everything right away. And he said, the problem is that it's all laid out in order, but it doesn't have a kind of a coherence, And he said, by the time you get to the end of the class in May, you don't want to read about a cruise. You feel like you're finished with something. He said, you have to think of a way to fold the cruise and the hospital into the class through flash forwards, flashbacks, but he said the class is the backbone of your experience because it goes through the Odyssey. The class is what takes the reader through the Odyssey itself. And then I had this great, non-light bulb moment, I guess, when I thought, well, I'm such an idiot, because the technique that he was describing of sort of embedded narratives, where there's a kind of a main narrative that digresses outward when it needs to incorporate relevant material, but returns to the main linear narrative, is exactly the way that Homer tells his stories. So here I was teaching a course on the Odyssey in which I described this narrative method at great length, and writing a book about the Odyssey, and I had sort of made the horribly ironic mistake of not taking the advice of the Odyssey. So Aristotle was already onto this, and he compares the Iliad and the Odyssey to a whole other bunch of epics which have not survived, probably for good reason, which were not as good. And he basically says the reason they're not as good is they make the mistake of telling things in the order that they happen as if they were histories, whereas the Iliad and the Odyssey have a central theme, a central action, the rage of Achilles, the homecoming of Odysseus, and everything flows out of that. And it's the stuff that flows out of that Homer figured out how to put in to this one main action. So that's what ring composition, which is the name of this technique, can accomplish. It subordinates digressions to a main narrative in a way that gives the main narrative texture, historicity, depth, but keeps you on track even as you digress to incorporate stuff that you need to incorporate.
What's the unifying action of Three Rings?
I would say I think Three Rings is a book about how the way that we tell stories relates to the way that we live. I think that's what it's about. I became very interested while I was writing my Holocaust book in sort of eerie coincidences that happen in real life. So, and in that book, I talk about that, just the most remarkable things kept happening to me as I was engaged in this 5-year-long search to find out what happened to my mother's relatives during the war. And, like old family friends from 50 years ago would like suddenly show up in elevators that I was taking in a hotel in Prague, or whatever, stuff like that. And it got me thinking about plot. I guess, the central concern of this book, and I've been able to refine my thinking about this through wonderful conversations like the one that we're having, on the occasion of its publication. I think that what this book is about is, what do we mean when we say something is too good to be true? When you say, it's so amazing, if you put it in a novel, nobody would believe it, right? And I think that's really what this book is about. Like, that literary narratives are of necessity constructed and elaborated and artful, right? I mean, there's all kinds of narrative, but to go back to Aristotle, right? We think that they should have a shape, a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be in that order, as we know, right, but they have to be there. And life, we feel, on the other hand, is random. But what we do as Homo sapiens, right, is we organize our experience through narratives. And I kept thinking about these coincidences, why are they so eerie in real life? And why is it that if you put these amazing, unbelievable real life coincidences in a novel, people would say, oh, it's too much, right? So we feel that somehow real life is random. We want a novel, or a certain kind of realistic novel, to replicate the randomness of real life. But of course it can't, because it has to be designed. Yeah. And that stuff began to obsess me. And so I constructed Three Rings as, in these 3 sections. Each one's devoted to a different one of my refugee writers, all of whom in some way were affected by the Odyssey. But as you know from reading the book, I tell this, and everything is true, but there are these remarkable coincidences and threads that tie together the lives of these 3 people who came from different countries at different periods in history, And so, for example, just to give a sort of innocuous example, because I don't like to give away the really amazing ones. So one of my characters is this amazing character, is a 17th and 18th century French archbishop who was the tutor of Louis XIV's grandson. And as a kind of an edifying treatise on how to be a good king, he wrote a kind of fan fiction based on the Odyssey called The Adventures of Telemachus, where he takes the character of Odysseus, his son, and he gives him a whole set of adventures. And in the adventures, it's all about meeting bad kings or good kings and what he learns from them. So Fénelon had become famous for conducting a school for girls who were being forced or advisedly chose to convert to Catholicism from Protestantism. And a lot of French Huguenots emigrated to Germany because of the anti-Protestant laws of Louis XIV. And so many ended up in Germany that there was a school that was founded called the Lycée Français, the French school, because they had to have a school for all these French people who were suddenly German. Erich Auerbach, one of my other heroes, went to the Lycée Français, So, I mean, these sort of little tentacular connections between historical events fascinate me. And I see these throughout the text to sort of keep reminding the reader that, life constructs narratives too. Life is a kind of author too. And that's what I wanted to that's what I think the book is about. Sorry, that was a long.
No, it was long and sublime. This tension between the randomness, the perceived randomness of the everyday life, and the yearning for order that narrative, or the need for order that narrative exists because of, brings to mind a contradiction that I wanted to mention, and I put it this way in my list of questions. I find your book a particularly powerful demonstration of the poetic force of coincidence, which is something you were just talking about. And I'm reminded of a cryptic comment buried in the work of D.W. Winnicott, the great British psychoanalyst, who once wrote that one of the tasks performed by the so-called good enough mother for her infant was to insulate the child from coincidence. That there's been a lot of speculation. There's been a lot of speculation over the years about what he really meant by that. And the prevailing understanding has been that the simultaneity of an internal state, infant's fear, hunger, rage, whatever, and an external event, a mother's emotional absence, could be combined in an infant's developing mind in a way that would elude the possibility for understanding, and that the only way for the infant to make sense of it would be to believe that there was an omnipotent connection between that internal feeling and the external result, and harming reality testing at an important time. I'm probably not alone in wondering if artists are artists precisely because of the failures to be shielded from coincidence in this particular.
Wonderful idea, yeah.
But the larger point is that coincidence seems to open up onto a great mystery in which the feeling of omniscience, a kind of omnipotence, suddenly feels viable. Coincidence is a doorway into an order of experience that can awaken us to a sense of mysterious, intoxicating interiority.
Yeah.
Muslim tradition would call it majesty. And I wanted to say that there's a lot of majesty in this little book. And I'm not sure what the question is, but it seems to me that that's, in a sense, what the book is about, is an attempt to evoke or create in the reader that sense of the miraculous interconnectedness of life.
Yeah, I mean, as I say, I had real experience of what you call the miraculous interconnectedness of life. And so, I was talking last week to Becca Rothfeld, very smart young critic, and, she raised the I think, interesting possibility that when you start to see these, you can get a little crazy, right? Because it starts to be all that you see, and that it makes you a little paranoid, which I think speaks to your Winnicottian concern. But I do think, look, it's interesting that you mention, psychoanalysis, because we do make sense of our experience through narratives. And the narratives that we tell about our lives are inadvertently revealing about things that we ourselves are not aware of. That's the whole point of psychoanalysis, in a way. If that were not the case, psychoanalysis wouldn't have anything to
Right.
work,
Right.
you know. And so I guess, you know, that what both the psychoanalyst and the book critic both do is for sort of looking for hidden patterns that the author or the speaker may not themselves be aware of. But the fact that there are patterns, that we seem to operate according to hidden logics, whether it's trauma, abuse, you know, whatever, that these are recognizable patterns, it just speaks, you know, to me, indicates that we are a species that needs meaning, and that we arrive at that meaning through narratives. And, you know, artists do it to a greater degree, say, than other people, writers, artists, you know, creative people. But so here I want to pull back and talk about this refugee business, because my book is haunted by all kinds of refugees, you know, not just the three figures who were themselves. Fénelon was exiled because he pissed off Louis XIV with this book, which was clearly meant as a critique of his reign. Sebald, as we said, was self-exiled. Auerbach had to run away from Hitler. But there's also, as you know, a lot in this book about whole histories of Europe, which seems to be constituted by people, whole populations fleeing, being chased out. The Jews and the Muslims expelled from Spain in 1492, the great founding year of the American continent, or certainly the way that we learned it back in the day. You know, Greek Byzantine scholars who fled in 1453 from the fall of Constantinople, which was a disaster for them, but it was also one of the founding dynamics of European civilization, because they brought Greek to Europe for the first time in 1,000 years. Stuff like that, you know, this, and Istanbul, as you know, becomes this sort of the central locus of my book. Everyone is either running to or running away from Istanbul in this sort of mad historical 50-yard dash, you know. And so on the one hand, you could say, oh, it's so amazing. You know, Auerbach went to the high school founded by the French Huguenots who had to run away from the religious intolerance of Louis XIV. You know, and then, as you know, Auerbach ends up being connected to Fénelon in this most bizarre way, which I won't talk about this evening, through the intermediary of a Muslim figure, a translator. And so you could say, oh, this is so amazing, you know, these coincidences of life, but they're not coincidences. You know, I'm inspired by what you said about Winnicott. You know, if you remember that human beings are terrible and someone is always chasing somebody out of some place, and that is the story. And so it's not a coincidence, because that's the way we are, you know, that European history, you know, this book is, I think, to the incisive reader, a kind of an anguished wrestling match with the European intellectual tradition, which, you know, on the one hand has given us such greatness, remarkable greatness, and yet so much of that greatness came out of horror, you know, and this, of which in my book, these refugees flowing east and west and east is the symbol. So I guess if one, as it were, psychoanalyzed European civilization, you know, you would see that there are these disorders which keep producing the same results. And that's why these are not finally coincidences, because the Protestants are always slaughtering the Catholics, and the classic Catholics are always slaughtering the Protestants, and everyone is always slaughtering the Jews and the Muslims and the, you know. And so in that sense, it's not so amazing that these results will often resemble each other, you know?
Right. Well, there is so much writing about trauma in the book, and so much evocation of it, both in terms of what you are investigating in your own family's history, but also, as you said, about the European continent, and also the particular traumas of the individuals that you write about more specifically, which I want to sort of approach that question of trauma in a formal way. At the heart of your book is the idea of the ring. And I think of Jacques Lacan, the French theorist, also a psychoanalyst, though whether he was clinically effective as a psychoanalyst is an entirely separate issue. But Lacan famously proposed that trauma was actually the instance of experience resisting language.
Right.
An experience that can't be somatized or digested or framed in a way that can be uttered. A void of sorts, a psychological void, an aporia, to use a word you use in the book, a gap that draws us back to it, a hole that often shapes our emotional life, giving us its contour. The contour of trauma, the circling of that void, that gap itself, and return to and circumambulation around it, this movement itself becomes a kind of ritual. The ritual that becomes synonymous with the shape that it takes on here in this book, which is that of a ring, the return always to the same place.
Yeah.
As you can tell, I was deeply taken by this idea of the curvilinear movement of the mind, of narrative, the many-turned tale, the many-turned hero, which is what Homer calls Odysseus. And I suppose this is an elaborate way of saying something simple, that your book seems to be making a case for form as a deeper kind of meaning. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, as form as a guiding principle?
Well, I mean, it's something I've always been interested in, and I think I'm very taken, Ayad, with your remark about trauma, because as you know, so one of the sections of the book is about Sebald, great German novelist, whom I describe as, or a literary analysis of whose works perfectly fits with what you were saying about trauma, right? That it's because trauma is ineffable in the true etymological meaning of that word. It's something that cannot be articulated, right? It cannot be effed, and the f in effed is from the Indo-European root to speak. So something that's ineffable literally cannot be spoken. And so much of Sebald's work, as I describe it in the third part of my book, is about, gives one the impression that he's narrating around World War II and the trauma of German guilt and the trauma of the Holocaust, but never actually lands on it, that it's like this black star that you can never look at, but you can only move around. And I think it's not accidental, and I go into this in my discussion of his work, that so many of his characters are literally walking around, they've all just had nervous breakdowns, and they're always taking these long ambling walks, all over England or whatever, or schlepping around Europe aimlessly. But the idea that, because this is going to reply to your question about form, right? The idea that circumambulating, that going around something may be a more powerful way of suggesting whatever it is at the center that caused you to avoid it, more powerfully than if you tried to describe it, right? What's the most famous piece of literary criticism in the 20th century? After Auschwitz, there can be no poetry, which of course is totally wrong, And so, but the idea that there's something so terrible that you can't speak about it, but you can speak about everything else, and the speaking about everything else implies the unspeakable thing, and in a more scary way, or a more effective way, let's say. So that's my interest in form is connected to my interest in historical disaster. I think, now that I'm getting older and I have enough space to look back at a lot of what I've done over the past now 35 years almost, both as a classicist and a student of the Holocaust, what clearly has drawn me are stories of lost civilizations. The Holocaust is unique because the civilization disappeared in 6 years instead of over the course of hundreds of years, the way the classical civilizations died out. And so I think this was pointed out to me. It's not an original observation. Somebody said, losing things seems to be very important to you. And I guess it is. I grew up in a kind of haunted house, a family haunted by this Holocaust loss. And I was drawn to ancient Greece and Rome, which are places that have to be reconstituted because they're not there anymore. And so I think this is another too long way of answering a question, but rings, writing around something, obliquity, are the ideal forms, I think, for a writer who is interested in what has been lost irretrievably. That there is no way to write it because it doesn't exist anymore. You can only imply it. As you know, one of the sort of a leitmotif of Three Rings is this business of model building, which keeps recurring in funny ways. I was a kid who was always building models of the Parthenon, in sixth grade or whatever. But the characters in Sebald books are making models of things. During my Holocaust book research, I went to a museum in Tel Aviv where they have dozens of models of synagogues from all over the Jewish diaspora. And this idea that the actual thing has disappeared and all you can do is keep modeling, keep mimicking, either by representing or by circumlocuting, is something that I think has given me a taste for a very specific kind of form.
Right.
And I think that's just me. It's not a prescription for everybody, but it certainly has given me a taste for things that have always excited me are works with these sort of belated moments of recognition. The aha that comes too late is to me the most psychologically and aesthetically powerful thing, and I think it's because of this.
You mention obliquity and opacity, or brings to mind opacity, and it brings to mind Auerbach, because the first two chapters of Mimesis, of course, deal with, on the one hand, Odysseus and the classical tradition, which in the book you articulate as a style that illuminates everything, that leaves nothing unsaid. And the Hebrew tradition, where Auerbach in chapter 2 goes through the story of Isaac, where you have ellipsis and what's not present as an essential part of the storytelling technique. Just to sort of, I think I mentioned this to you once, reading Auerbach was one of the great reading Mimesis, one of the great experiences of my life, certainly as a writer. And I was a different person after reading that book, and a different writer after reading that book. I understood something about language and its ability to craft and create reality. Could you tell us a little bit more about Auerbach? And he's just such a fascinating, the legend that he wrote this magisterial book, which is this granular take on, syntax and grammar in the Western tradition of the representation of reality. And they didn't have any books with him because he was in exile.
Right. So Auerbach was a great scholar of medieval European literature. And in 1936, he lost his job because of the anti-Jewish laws in Germany, and he fled to Istanbul. And in Istanbul, he wrote the great masterpiece, which is probably the greatest single work of literary criticism of the 20th century, called Mimesis, which is the Greek word for mimicry. And the subtitle is the representation of reality in Western literature. And the idea is that he takes 20 works over 20 centuries, and he looks at a passage from each work and sort of dissects it in this very sort of friendly, it's not academic-y at all, which is the miracle of this book. And he just shows you that the narrative and technical effects that make things feel real when we read a work of literature. Why does something feel real in a work of literature? How does an author, and he goes from Homer to James Joyce and Proust and Virginia Woolf, and he covers, he covers the waterfront. And the legend was that, or he complained that he had come from these incredibly rich, sophisticated German academic institutions with huge libraries. And now he's in Istanbul, which actually does have a library, but it's not on the level of what he had to leave behind. And so he himself, in a endnote to a subsequent edition of Mimesis, said that not having access to the resources that he would have had access to back in Germany, it was a kind of an okay library, but not having access to all the scholarly literature and the secondary sources and the articles made him write in a way that was freer and sort of let his memory of these works. So as you know, I in my book, Three Rings, at the sort of end of the Auerbach chapter, characterized Mimesis itself as a kind of model. The poignancy of Auerbach is here he's writing this great ode to the greatness of Western literary civilization, of European civilization, while Europe was yet again tearing itself into pieces, And so in that sense, the book itself is a kind of model of a civilization that was being destroyed as he wrote it, and I find that very, very poignant. And it touches me a lot because, what do you have? These Byzantine monks fleeing the fall of Constantinople in 1453, running hysterically to Italy with, what were they carrying? Books. That kickstarted the Italian Renaissance. What was the most important thing? Books. And I think that's very moving because it is finally what constitutes the civilization, as bad as those civilizations can be. And I think Auerbach poignantly expresses the kind of anguish that I or anybody else who studies European civilization for a living, which is the greatness is inextricably entwined with the horribleness, and that's something you just have to deal with. And these stories that I tell in this book are stories of, there's a kind of hidden joke, as you know, in the title, because there are actually 4 rings. And the 4th ring is not European. And the figure who actually ends up connecting Auerbach, Fénelon, and Sebald is in fact a Turk, a Muslim who was a translator of Fénelon, and in the most remarkable way connects the dots between everybody. And I think there's a kind of poignancy in the fact that it's a non-European who successfully does the work of bringing the 3 rings into contact with one another.
It's beautiful. Folks, please, if you have any questions for Daniel, this is your chance. So put them into the Q&A and or the chat. Daniel, in talking about Auerbach, and how much he's meant to me and how formative reading him has been, I'm reminded of a deeper question or a deeper thing that concerns me, or I spend a lot of time thinking about, which is the pedagogical value of the critic. To me, the great critics that have formed me, Susan Sontag, Eric Bentley, Harold Bloom, and I do put you in the category of the great humanist instructors, and who by force of spirit and learning evoke or remind us of the register of wisdom that I think is the actual subject and the content of it's the reason that we are drawn to it. And I wonder if you could speak about the atmosphere of criticism today at a time when opinion and criticism seem to be conflated, where opinion on the one hand seems to come from a lack of knowing things, whereas criticism seems to, be only possible after, deep reflection and research and understanding, intimacy with the thing that one is criticizing. When there might be less space for the critic as teacher, because the critic as salesperson has become even more important given the way we interact and communicate. So I guess in a way, I'm asking you to speak to the intellectual atmosphere that we're in, but with this particular bent or this particular idea that there's something essential for the critic to be doing in educating us, alerting us to what matters, why we should be reading something, and how we should be thinking about things.
Well, look, I'm old school, as most people know. I mean, I've written about this. I wrote a long piece for the New Yorker maybe 10 years ago when there was a moment of great controversy about the role of critics. And I wrote this piece called the Critics Manifesto. I mean, I think that, a critic, a real critic, is someone who has, been deeply immersed in a subject or subjects, who actually knows something about the subject and helps you think about this. Bob Gottlieb, whom I mentioned earlier, always jokes with me when I always give him all my pieces before I send them into my editor. And he says, never forget, criticism is a service industry, and I believe that. I mean, I think the critic is there to help the ordinary reader to sort of make more profound their own reading of, or, whatever it is, a music critic, a jazz critic, doesn't matter what it is. It's someone whose expertise has to intersect in an interesting, stylish way with a subject, and you have to bring actual expertise, and that's different from having an opinion. Now, for reasons that we all know, the explosion in different kinds of media that started 25 years ago has made it possible for people to express their opinions publicly in a way that is unprecedented in human history, which is in many ways a good thing. It's a good democratic thing, blah, blah, blah. But having an opinion is not the same as being an expert. And that's fine. I mean, that's fine. I have opinions about things that I don't know a lot about. We all do, right? But I think that if anything, the explosion of opinionating makes the role of the real critic more important. I don't know why people have to resent expert. I don't resent, that's why I have a doctor, they know more about the human body than I do. I mean, I don't know why, this instantly has engendered resentment, except,
Well, my ignorance is as good as your knowledge because it's mine.
Yeah. And that's obviously wrong. And so, I still remember the first time when my first book came out in 1999, Amazon reviews were like a new thing, if you can believe that. I still remember being absolutely astonished. People said, oh, and then you can see what people think of your book. Who gives a fuck what people think of my book? Unless they have a PhD in literature. I mean, I'm exaggerating for the sake of humor, but I mean, of course, you want to know what readers think, and it's always interesting, but it's not the same. It's like if I call, my brother, whom and I say, oh, I have this weird red spot on my right arm. Is that something? And he'll say, oh, yeah, I think I've read something online. That's not the same as going to a dermatologist, right? And that's the difference between criticism and Amazon reviews. And it's fine, there's room for everything. That's not the issue. But I do think, especially given, look, this is an interesting conversation to have in the light of the recent news about Twitter,
Right out of the Roman Republic, Daniel.
Yeah, no, but I mean, it's worth thinking about the power of certain kinds of rhetoric that are not informed by actual expertise or are in fact deliberately aligned against expertise. So I think, to pull this back to literary criticism, I always learn from reading critics. They are the psychoanalysts of literature, right? That's what critics do. They look at stuff and they see the things that the people who made these books didn't even see when they wrote them. People do it to me, I do it to other people. And I think it's very useful and very important.
Olga Gurin has a question that's connected to a question I didn't ask, which I had, which her question here is, did you know that your characters were interconnected when you started writing this book, or did you discover this as the book unfolded? And my way of asking that question was about convergence, that convergence is so central to the book. and the convergences are so surprising and pleasurable, what part of that was trust that you would stumble into those convergences, and what part of it was design?
Well, a lot of it I didn't know. I mean, there's a kind of climactic revelation in this book that I did not know about. It just came out of research that I was doing about this amazing Turkish fellow in the late 19th century who translated Fénelon's book, The Adventures of Telemachus, into Turkish. And he ended up turning out to be connected to Auerbach in the most remarkable, unimaginable way. And that's something I just came across. Well, actually asked Elif Batuman to help me translate Turkish Wikipedia articles and stuff, and this stuff started to emerge, and I was like, but and sometimes what it's like when you write, you have a kind of hunch about something, you just, but quite often it's, I mean, I hate to keep coming back to this, but it's accidental or serendipitous. Proust turned out to have a connection, which is the climax of the Fénelon chapter to Fénelon.
It's a miraculous little.
It's amazing, but that I was just reading through a volume of Proust's letters once, and I opened to one that had indicated what his connection to Fénelon was in the most amazing way. So I don't know. I think it quite often happens, and Winnicott may be the only person who can understand why this happens, but when you are working on a piece, you get into this zone where either connections are already there, but you're primed to see them, or you're sort of making them happen in some way. I don't even know how to describe it, but it's interesting to think about in light of the interests of this book, obviously. But yeah, so I didn't know. Some of them I knew, and I orchestrated to create these sort of aha moments, but some I actually found out while I was writing.
David Nyman has a follow-up to this question about coincidence, but before we get to that, Richard Holloway would like to say, interesting to me, given your comments about repetitions, coincidences due to horrors in human history, that the Odyssey is central to this and to your previous books. To me, the Iliad seems to be about timeless repetitive traumatic patterns. Its recognitions come too late. The Odyssey seems to chart a path out of the Iliad's trauma-based, trauma-inflicting violence. It seems to present its recognitions in time to avoid repeating the Iliad's patterns. Thoughts?
I see Richard as a follow-up question. Would I care to comment on the difference between the Odyssey and the Iliad in light of the concerns I raise in Three Rings? Well, it's interesting. I mean, the classic way to think about the difference between the Odyssey and the Iliad is ultimately tragic in its vision of human life, and the Odyssey is essentially comic. I think those are true. The Iliad, one could say, is about this sort of constant reinscription of traumatic behaviors, even though people are aware of them. Achilles is a hero who suddenly starts to wonder what it's all about, a classic late adolescent crisis, and comes close to being able to imagine a different kind of life for himself. But ultimately, the forces that are pushing him towards this destructive, violent, heroic action overwhelm whatever insight he may have that there could be another peaceful life where he's sitting around eating Doritos and watching Netflix. And so I think that's an interesting, Richard Holloway's point, I think, is interesting, well taken, where the Odyssey is about escaping from the Iliad in a funny way and inventing a new kind of heroine, or inventing a way of life that is a peacetime way of life. And a lot of the Odyssey is equally, I would say, about the difficulty of escaping from a known pattern into a new pattern. One of the things he has to do once he gets home from the Trojan War is figure out how to not be at war anymore. So I think that's a very interesting way to think about about the two. In that light, though, it's ironic, or there's a kind of cross current, because the Odyssey is the more ring-like, annular construction, more so than the Iliad, which does have a more linear progression. And that's, I can't work all this out off the top of my head, but I think it's certainly worth, it's worth thinking about. It's like the structure of the one seems more appropriate to the philosophy of the other in some way. And that may be deliberate.
Interesting. David Nyman would like to connect my question about the force, the poetic force of coincidence. He'd like to connect that to fate in the subtitle of Three Rings. Do you ever feel or yearn to feel that these coincidences uncovered are more than that, if not fate, but that these coincidences arise meaningfully beyond accidental connection? I think he's pushing you a little bit into maybe Winnicott's not the only one with an answer to this. And if not, how does fate find itself part of the subtitle?
Well, so here's how I answer that question, and I'm not going to be able to do full justice to it. But so when I kept having these remarkable moments during the writing of The Lost, and people would say, as I said, it's a book about trying to find out about the fates, as we use that word, about the fates of these 6 members of my family. It was not a happy book to write or research, obviously. But because of these remarkable coincidences, quite often I was led to the right place and the right time and made the right discoveries and whatever. And people, when I would go home after each research trip and say, oh, I found this, or I learned this, or I met this person who helped me find that person, or whatever. And people would say, oh, it's not a coincidence. God is showing you the way, or it's karma, or, all the ways that we try to express that force that seems to be at work. And being not a religious person, I think of it this way. I look at it from the other end of the telescope. If I had never left the Upper West Side, nothing would have happened. In other words, but it's a sort of Heraclitan, perhaps, vision, right? By stepping into the stream of life, you create ripples, and sometimes you notice the ripples, and so I think that by looking for your lost relatives in the Holocaust, you set in motion certain kinds of things that create these coincidences or wonderful serendipities or whatever. But certainly, if you don't look for them, nothing will happen. Right? And if you don't write the book about narrative and randomness versus coincidence, you're not going to open the diary of Proust, the volume of Proust's letters, and find the letter that connects Proust to Fénelon. You know what I mean? So yeah, I don't think of it as a supernatural necessarily phenomenon, but I do think that we make things happen when we go looking at things, and so you could say, look, it's not that amazing that Auerbach, a German guy, went to a high school that 300 years earlier was founded by French Protestant refugees. But I make you think it's amazing because I put it in the book, right? So the purposefulness of the act of seeking or the act of creating creates the rings, closes the rings, makes things that could not be that extraordinary look more extraordinary because you have lined them up in a certain way. And that's maybe the most important way in which the work of the writer is like the work of history. It happens in a certain way and it forces you to look at certain things. And when you look at certain things in a certain context, they seem to be, wow, they all line up. But that's only because I'm telling you to look at them.
Right. Nav is asking me to recommend a book for delving into coincidence. And of course, there's only one book that I could recommend, which is yours right now. And I think on that note, let's celebrate you and this remarkable book and the publication of it in paperback. And thank you for the hour you've given us, Daniel.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks so much, both of you guys, for all the conversation and for joining us this evening. And thanks to everyone out there for tuning in to this. Please go and pick up a copy of Three Rings and definitely enjoy it and get the rest of that, everything we're talking about. So anyway, check out our upcoming virtual events we have on pals.com, and we hope to see you all at another one again.
Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Ayad.
Everybody, thanks a lot.
Good night. Pleasure.